Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast. Today's guest is Eric, and he can be found on Instagram and on Twitter at Eric's Electrons. In this episode, we talk about his life as somebody who has denied the narrative offered him as a black man in America, being one founded principally on oppression, and we talk about his way of viewing the world that is an alternative to the victim-oppressor dynamic. And we also talk about the fallout of not believing in the victim-oppressor narrative as a black man in America. He is an undergraduate studying physics, and that might give you some clue as to what he bases his opinions upon. It's a great conversation with a regular dude. And so I'm going to step out of the way here and introduce you to Eric.
All right, perfect.
You ready to dive in?
I am, yeah. I'm ready.
What's you classify yourself as a student? Is that accurate?
Yeah. I'm an undergrad student in physics. I'm on my third year now, coming up this semester. So yeah.
Yeah. Would you be amenable to kind of positioning yourself on some sort of political compass? Is that too?
No, I mean, I consider myself as independent and politically homeless, but yeah, I mean, it ranges with issues. Sometimes I lean right, sometimes I lean left. Like, it all depends. But
kind of a wandering kind of guy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And how long have you been kind of active on Twitter specifically, or within the political conversation?
So I used to be active during the beginning of when Twitter was like popular with like news, I would say. So like, no, not the beginning. Okay, I started being active when Osama bin Laden died.
Oh.
Yeah, I remember seeing like the tweet that said, "Oh, there's an explosion going on," and then after that, soon the news reported that and put that in a tweet. I mean, put that in their reports and stuff, and then I started becoming more active on there. But this account specifically, it wasn't, I think maybe like 3 years ago, probably like 3 years ago, I started this account. So yeah, that was another account that I now deleted, I think. So yeah. What about you? Have you been on? How about you? Like with Twitter, like have you been on for a while or no?
Exactly about 3 years now. I started Twitter when I started reporting on what happened at my college, Evergreen State College.
Oh, okay. I see. Wow. Yeah, that was crazy. And I love your series on that, by the way. Like I'm just always like waiting on the next one to come out. I haven't seen the newest one that you've put out, I don't think, but yeah, I keep up with those pretty well.
Is anything ring a bell with your undergraduate experience and what is kind of shown at Evergreen, or is it a completely different environment that you're in?
The undertones of it definitely show. So what I mean by that is what shows is like the language that's being used, like the language that's being used and with professors, be it with the syllabus or when you see little banners up, or whenever conservatives try to talk, you see the counter stuff like, oh, a white supremacist is coming to our campus, like that type of rhetoric. So yeah, I mean, you see the language being used. It's not as extreme, at least yet, but I do see that fostering on our campus because our campus is very left-leaning.
Okay. And within your domain of STEM and physics, is it kind of leaching in there or leaking in and leaching away from?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely leaking in. I mean, I'm a part of a couple of physics organizations as a member, and there are a couple of people who are in the higher ups who are heavily influenced by critical race theory and intersectionality politics, and they're into the, canceling culture and doing all that type of stuff. And then, of course, you have those who are in physics in physics conferences saying that we should talk about racial issues and how that needs to be like mandatory and all this other stuff. So it's leaking in. And then plus there was a physicist that was fired at CERN for saying some things. I think this was like a year ago, maybe.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely leaked into the STEM fields.
What's your take on it? And has your position changed over time, seeing how it works out? Or?
Yeah, at first I thought it was just like a fringe group that could possibly be something bad, and I didn't understand. I was too naive to like how bad it actually was. And so I think I changed when it came to it becoming policy to do certain things, or seeing that affirmative action efforts and initiatives called diversity groups and stuff, those being promoted in our system, and instead of it being about science, it's all about what your race is, and instead of the panels being about the top experts in the field, it's about what color or gender the person is. Like it's become heavily influenced by identity politics. So I've gotten more aggressive with my kickback with a lot of this identity politics stuff.
Have you gotten kickback for your kickback?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I would say the most is from like, be it PhD students or actual PhDs. I was actually featured in a class as a tweet to look out for, or type of people to look out for, from a professor. Not at my school, at some school, but she tweeted me and said that, I'm using your tweet in my class to show as an example of people to look out for when it comes to reaching social justice and all this other stuff. So yeah, I have a lot of kickback from the STEM community, and the STEM community is actually worse than what people report it to be. It's really? A lot worse. Mm-hmm.
What did that professor mean by looking out for people like you? What is a person like you, or what was she referring to?
I think she was referring to my talking points, because as you know, identity politics, when it comes to talking points, they have counter talking points that aren't really arguments. So they'll say something like, let's say, for instance, with this whole Terry Crews situation, or no, let's say, for instance, with a police shooting situation, you'll say something like, or they'll say police shootings happen disproportionately more to Black people. But then you mention the fact that Black people have more interactions with police because Black people commit more crimes on average, or at a higher rate. And then they will use that part and say, this is a talking point that you should watch out for because they are promoting white supremacy. And then that's the way to stop the argument and to call you a troll and to deem you as a person not to talk to.
Yeah, I think one technical term for that is a thought-terminating cliche. They box you into alt-right or white supremacist or all these different guilt by association tactics, and calling your points a talking point is itself a talking point to just shut down
exactly.
any sort of debate and stuff. Exactly.
Yeah, it's really, it reminds me of the terms that are made up, like I heard of this term, sea lining, I think it's called. I can't really say that word right. Sea lining is basically when you ask for a discussion or a debate instead of, talking divisively at someone. Like they think that you're begging for a debate, or you're trying to bully them into debating with you, when really you could actually be trying to have a discussion, a meaningful discussion, and they'll call you a sea lioner or something of that degree, and that stops the debate completely because it rids them of the accountability of providing evidence for their arguments.
Has it been the case for you that you were attracted to what we call identity politics at some point, or have you always been kind of resistant to that? And what is behind that attraction or resistance?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, yes, I have been heavily influenced by identity politics growing up. And I think it's more so because I grew up in California. I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Oakland, California, moved to Pittsburgh. And, everyone around me was pretty much Democrat, liberal. I only had one type of view, although I never was fully influenced by like the divisive culture of that. I still was into that. In middle school, I described myself as a pacifist, and I even described myself as a socialist at one point. It wasn't until about sophomore year of high school where I really dug deep and started reading material from these problematic people that they started calling them, and then analyzing the arguments for myself. And I mean, it wasn't until all the way up until I would say when Black Lives Matter first started, I remember supporting them, but not necessarily being like, full blown left leaning as I was like in middle and the beginning of high school. And once the Trayvon Martin stuff started coming out, like the evidence that backed the story of George Zimmerman and then the others, like Michael Brown, when the DNA evidence came out and the FBI investigation was over, and I saw that Black Lives Matter was still promoting the lie of that they were just completely innocent and they were just killed for no reason, that's when I broke away completely from identity politics and didn't want anything else to do with it. It was after those two events, I would say, definitely.
Mm-hmm. What is the I guess we can talk about what is the cost of backing out of that. But do you feel that your identity as a Black man makes it really important for you to be at least talking about identity politics and having an opinion on it? Can you escape that because your identity is kind of rather featured, at least this point in history, and with regards to Black Lives Matter and then the civil rights movement?
I think due to where I come from, I have a compassion for, those that are in hard situations, no matter, what race they are. But, especially when it comes to issues involving Black people, that's something I can't escape because I'm a Black person myself. And I've done a lot of digging myself and a lot of self-research when it came to the arguments on both sides. Like I really tried to get to the truth and not like go one way or the other, because I was very, very left, where I would reference and quote Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which I've read many times and now disagree with. I've read and quoted all the other books that are praised by the intelligentsia on the left when it comes to Black racial issues. I've read the autobiographies of people like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, or what's another one, like Frederick Douglass and people like that. Like I've done this like throughout my life because my mom and my dad definitely encouraged me to be very voracious reader. Like I started reading very young, so I've always read. And when I came out of this and actually started having an opinion on this, I felt it was necessary for two main reasons. I mean, one, because like I come from these areas, and I think Black on Black crime is one of the biggest issues in the Black community, as well as the lack of education and the prioritizing of the welfare state, I think is a bad thing too. So like that's one. And then two, as kind of a deterrent for people to not to reconsider opinions, because there are many people who wouldn't consider your opinion just because of your skin color. Like they would be like, oh, he's just privileged and that's the reason why he believes what he believes, instead of listening to the arguments that you're making. Whereas with me, they can't come with me with the privilege thing. By their logic, I can't be privileged, I can't be racist. But at the same time, they call me a self-hating person who was racist against Black. So that's a weird paradox there. But I think it's important for me to speak out because there are a lot of people on even both sides, I think, that aren't going to consider the opinion of people who are not black. And I think for those two main reasons, that's the reason why I think it's necessary to be outspoken during these times.
Who do you think, is there somebody that you kind of look up to as like a model or a role model in kind of carving out your place in the conversation?
I kind of share the same sentiment as Neil deGrasse Tyson on this. Like I look at a role model as like taking people as like a collage, and I have like a collage of attributes and characteristics that I take from different people. So yeah, there's just a whole bunch of people that I pull from, that I get inspiration to keep on going, or to realize that, you know, what I'm going through or any cancel campaigns against me really isn't nothing compared to what these guys and gals went through in the past, you know?
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, we can talk about this Terry Crews quote. Do you mind if I quote what he wrote today? And this is...
No, I don't mind at all.
I think this is I know he got a little in trouble or whatever. He did something, he wrote something similar a couple weeks back, but today he wrote, "If you are a child of God, you are my brother and sister. I have family of every race, creed, and ideology." And then this is the problematic quote-unquote statement. "We must ensure Black Lives Matter doesn't morph into Black Lives Better." And that right away just ended up in trending, that he got in trouble for this. But what did you see? What's your response? And then what did you see the response to this as?
My response is, like, I agree with him. You know, he's seeing an issue that a lot of people see within the Black Lives Matter movement, which is it's promoting like Black lives and almost like a Black supremacist attitude with it. And we know, you know, from recent videos that Black Lives Matter activists are heavily influenced by Marxists, and they call themselves Marxists. So that's another thing. But I'm pretty sure that he's seeing that there's a lot of divisiveness that we all see. But for him to bring it up, they're grouping him with the All Lives Matter crowd. And that's not what he's doing. He's just simply pointing out the fact that, hey, like, it's a warning, basically. Like, hey, like, let's not go here with it. Let's look at one another as equals, as we say we are. So, yeah, but unfortunately, you know, many people have misquoted him or, you know, call him names instead of answering anything that he said.
What do you think is the resistance to this call for unity? Or I guess aside from the call to unity, a call to temperance with regards to the movement of Black Lives Matter? Why is there a resistance to tempering that?
I think it's because identity politics groups tend to not want to have that discourse with their opponents at all. Like, I think identity politics groups, they want to make it so that to call for unity, you're taking away awareness of the specific group that you're trying to help. That's what they look at as all like unity quotes or measures. So their whole thing is black, 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 and if you deviate from that in any way, shape, or form, then you are siding with the oppressor. And it's that oppressor versus oppressive narrative that is very Marxist in nature, as I'm sure you know. So that's the issue there. There's no having a discourse with people like that if, you know, you can't even have a call for unity on something as basic as, you know, we're all, you know, brothers and sisters, or we're all of a similar nation or something like that. You know, I think that camaraderie is very important, but to people who are heavily influenced by identity politics, is only important if you agree with them.
Have you been, do you feel oppressed? Is that
No.
a narrative that, no?
No, yeah, definitely not. I don't feel oppressed at all. I never felt oppressed. Even my left of left days, I never felt oppressed by anyone because I wasn't brought up taught like that. I wasn't brought up taught that um uh, like I'm inescapably oppressed and there's no way out of it. Like I was taught that you're supposed to judge people by the content of their character, and your shortcomings is on you, and even if it's on someone else, then cool, but don't let that ruin your day. Keep it pushing, keep it moving, and eventually you'll get to your desired outcome.
Was that backed
Yeah.
up by, I'm just curious, was that backed up by going to church, or what's the philosophical or theological pedigree of your parents? Because this is a refrain that I've seen in people who have been offered the chance to be a victorious victim, but they're taught a completely other framework where that doesn't really match up. So I'm just wondering. Where did it come
Yeah,
from for you?
so I think, my mom is a Christian woman. My dad, I would describe him as a deist. Like, he's not heavily like religious. He does believe in God though. So, but they never really pushed anything in particular onto me. I would say my inspiration usually came from books or came from authors and reading about philosophy and the Stoics, definitely. So, I've just always been told to take accountability. Or I would credit that my dad, since he was in the Marines, he had a very like take accountability like type of attitude about everything. Even if it's not your fault, still take accountability and move on. And he would always say that, like, no matter what happened, like, handle it how you handle it, and handle it yourself, and don't cry and complain about it. Just handle it and move on. So I would credit that.
Why do you think that's not represented across our society right now? It seems like everybody's vying for victimhood in a way.
Yeah, I think it's easier. It's easier to be mad at someone else. It's easier to point fingers at everyone else but yourself. It's easier to blame others for your own shortcomings. It's harder to look inward and say, like, okay, this is what I need to change. This is what I need to do. Or there's some problems within my community that I could have some type of accountability for. So, yeah, I think people do whatever is most convenient to them.
And what
Yeah.
about STEM? How do you see it going forward from where you are now, or what kind of impact do you think you'll be able to have on that, the encroachment of identity politics into STEM?
I'm hoping to bring a differing viewpoint. And I'm not trying to disagree for the sake of disagreeing. I'm just trying to provide people with another viewpoint, because people in STEM, what people don't understand is, like, they're studying hard and long on a very specific topic for a very long period of time. They don't have time to really analyze politics or read political theory or read about Marxism, the history of it, or any of that stuff. Like, they're in the book studying, because this stuff does take a long time to really, like, get decent at. So they have a very surface level understanding of what's going on, and they think that, oh, like, Black Lives Matter is just saying that, it's just being on the right side of history. That's their view about things. They're like, oh, you can just be kind and that's it, or just support this group and that's it. They don't think about, like, the group's affiliations, the things that the group members or the founders have said. They don't take the time to really investigate. So the only other way that they're able to hear this stuff is from other people within the field. But of course, when it's told by other white people in STEM, like, they're written off as just having privilege, and that's the reason why they believe what they believe, because they don't surround themselves with other non-white people who are in STEM who actually think differently. Because there are many Black people in STEM who lean conservative, or many Asian people in STEM that lean conservative on things, but you never really hear from them because, one, a lot of them are scared to come out and say anything, and two, when they do say stuff, they're either blackballed or just kind of like ignored in a way within these STEM circles. And STEM is very much like Mean Girls, the movie. Like it's very catty, very, very catty.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's extremely catty. I have stories for days about how catty it is. So,
do you have you tried to take an inventory of your own privilege? I've been told to do that, so I've had to do that. But I wonder if you tried to do that.
Yeah, I'm still looking at I'm still gathering all the evidence from our privilege, and I don't know if I'll ever be done with that list.
Have you been subjected to those trainings though? And what's your take on being in that kind of room?
I've sat in on those, and of course I've taken like I've taken a women's studies class just to see what it was about. But yeah, my take on it though is it's a lot of assumptions, and it's a lot of what I dislike most about the diversity efforts are the assumption that there's a collective trauma that's happening with Black people. Like all Black people suffer from collective trauma of slavery, Jim Crow, and any aggression or mistreatment of any Black person to ever live. And that's just not true. Like I understand the horrors of slavery. I understand that it's bad. I understand Jim Crow. I understand all the little stuff that's happened since then that weren't in favor of Black people. However, at the same time, I have no trauma from those events because I didn't go through them. And I think when people are raised to internalize the trauma of others, that's bad. But that's I mean, I'm not going to say it's child abuse, but it's some type of psychological abuse in a way that there are tons of Black children being taught that police are out to kill them in 2020. You know, and that they should internalize the struggles of people that they never met, or that things that they never went through. So that's not talked about nearly as much as the other stuff that's not talked about. But these diversity efforts, they keep on with the lie that Black people are a collective instead of a group of individuals.
Yeah, with a lot of different, even if they are a collective, there's a lot of texture within various different, affiliations and groups and individuals coming together.
Yeah, there's subgroups and there are, subgroups of subgroups. I mean, it's just a never-ending thing, and the only remedy for that is to look at Black people individually, on a case-by-case basis instead of just this collective or unified theory of oppression.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed racism happening to you? Is it something that you're aware of? And it seems like this training wants you to be hyper aware of it. It wants everybody to be hyper aware of it. But before this training, was it a reality in your life?
I mean, I've had instances where I could attribute to racism. So yeah, I have been a part of racist incidents or whatnot. I just don't think the training really helps in that regard. I mean, it might help with some maybe to see things like, I don't know, like I've heard of the whole microaggression thing, and I think that's a crazy idea because someone asking where you're from, for instance, is looked at as a microaggression, and that's just small talk of how to start a conversation in most circles. But like if you were to do it to someone who's heavily influenced by identity politics and you were to ask where they're from, they'll assume that you're being racist, and I don't believe in that. But like I've heard of stories of people coming up to people and like grabbing their hair and be like, oh, I never felt hair like this. And I can understand how that could be an issue, but I don't agree with how people address that issue. Like if someone were to grab my hair, like I'm gonna be like, hey, like, I need my personal space, back up, like, please don't. You address it. But what people are taught to do is internalize this as something that applies to all non-oppressed groups, and then to also go on Twitter or some social media and make a campaign about it and cancel people. And I don't think that's a good solution to that issue, as well as the many other solutions that diversity efforts have.
Well, in another way of asking the same question, what is your advice on somebody in your situation with someone close to your identity when they are confronted with a racist incident or some sort of racist behavior, and how do you advise people get through that situation?
It really depends on like the type of situation it is. Like a racist situation at a job would be different from a racist situation that was like at a store or something, because there's power dynamics at a job versus at a store with a random person. It really isn't. But I would mostly advise people, because I see this as a issue, to really look and make sure that it's not an actual racist issue, because there are a lot of times where people would swear up and down that something was a racial issue, and they'll tell me about it, and I'm like, I just don't see a racial element in that, other than the fact that you're of a certain color and that other person is of a certain color, and but to even question that, they say you're erasing their experiences, or they'll use other language like you're attacking their experiences, and all this other like victimhood language, so I would say to really analyze whether or not that case is an actual racial incident, and then if you're like at a store, for instance, and someone says something racial to you because of whatever reason, like, okay, cool, walk away. Like, it's not a big deal. If it's something regarding your job, go through the proper channels of recording that incident, because even if nothing is done, at least it will be on record and you can handle it then. It's sort of the same advice my dad gave me when it comes to police interactions and how, like, you could do something that could possibly save your life. He said, never fight police on the street, fight them in court. And the thing is, with that is, like, at least you'll be alive to fight them in court versus resisting arrest, fighting them in the street, which would lead to you dying, and then you can no longer fight, and then your family is left without you. And there's more negative trade-offs with fighting a police officer in the street versus the court in most situations. So yeah, it's just all about the situation, and I would say to think critically about whatever it is that you would deem racist. Yeah,
give yourself at least one other option to interpret that interaction, maybe.
Yeah, or give people the benefit of the doubt. Like the problem is, a lot of people have racism first as the possible conclusion, and then they find evidence to support that. It's the opposite of the scientific method, where you make an observation, you form a hypothesis, and you go through the steps and then analyze your data and then come to a conclusion. So they work their way backwards, and that's how most social justice efforts work. They start with that main conclusion of white supremacy, racism, and then they work backwards. I think it would help people if they didn't start with a conclusion, but they started with the observation and then tried their best to give the benefit of the doubt and find all possible alternatives instead of just running to racism.
It really does show in aggregate, just watching everybody, or watching a certain mass of people really adopt this conclusion first just way of interacting with the world. And it doesn't, you can even extract it from identity politics or progressivism or Marxism. It's just the fact that they are starting with a conclusion and then working back from that really does create collective madness in a way. And that's why I'm really in this odd situation, because I'm seeing the same thing that happened at Evergreen happening like worldwide. And it does have to do with this, projecting of a problem or an answer or something onto the world and not allowing yourself any sort of wiggle room.
Yeah. And has that happened to you, like, be it before the Evergreen situation or after, where, you said something and then someone automatically assumed it was racism, and then Like, has that ever happened to you?
Yeah, but more the line of ticking off young feminists. You make a joke and then they automatically think that you're talking about sex and you're not at all. Or you offer to help them with this object that's twice their size and they get offended that you're catering to them or making them out to be weak, and it's like, no, I'm just being helpful, or I'm just being jocular. That was historically, that's where I would butt up against people who are projecting something onto the world.
Okay.
Constantly.
So you have more pushback from the feminist side of identity politics than the racial side, basically.
Yeah. I mean, okay. The racial stuff, I mean, I guess in a certain way, I could definitely be criticized because I just kind of operated in my own bubble that didn't have a lot of racial diversity until I moved to Chicago. And then I moved from Chicago back to the Pacific Northwest, which again was operating in not a lot of racial diversity. But I have always sought out people based on their brains, or based on their the way that they think, and that was how I would strike up, friendships and stuff like that. But I wasn't exposed to a lot of racial difference. It was really interesting in Chicago because in Chicago there's a lot of races, and at one point in history, not too long ago, it was the most diverse city in the world. And since it's been surpassed by another city in America, but in Chicago it was all very segregated. So there's all these different ethnicities, but they're all very segregated. And you could pass through, like, there was this one street that had 40 different ethnicities on it.
Oh, wow.
And so my life and my living there, I'd be exposed to a different culture, be it Black or Asian or something, like just by sharing a wall with that culture, and but not having direct interaction with them myself. And so it really expanded me, but I didn't get a lot. I didn't get a lot of exposure to direct different cultures, but it always seemed to be a cultural thing and not a racial thing to me. It's that that race and racism has informed different cultures for sure, and by segregating them or by causing different tensions between these different cultures. But basically, essentially, it comes down to the values that a group holds, and like, what do they find beautiful, what do they find appropriate, and so on. That's how I interact or plug into other people culturally. Race has never been that big of a deal to me. But again, Robin DiAngelo would say it's because I'm white and I've been protected from ever having to think that way. So.
Yeah. And I think that's the case for most people in terms of like how you look at the world. Like, race isn't really a thing. It's all about your values or similar interests. Like when we look at gamers, for instance, like, we see gamers of all types like hang around together, and it's because they're all gamers. There's a gaming culture. When it comes to sports, it's this way. In most cases, people don't look at race as the first thing to consider someone as a friend or to be interested in their life. So yeah, I think it's pretty normal. But like you said, the Robin DiAngelos of the world like to make it as specifically a white thing instead of a people thing. Yeah, it's really weird.
It's worrying to me because I don't know how it's going to shake out, but it really is a regression with all these diversity bureaucrats coming in and forcing everybody to go through this training. And if you look at like the basis of the training, at least with Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi, it's very the assumption is that racism controls everything. It's a fiction and it's a reality at the same time. So it's based on crazy logic, but ultimately it's going to force us to erase all of our culture in order to fit in these really sterile conceptions of race to begin with. They're not artists. They don't really have like a great thing to show us about. Even when they reduce everybody to their race, it's not like these races are filled with life in their conception. It doesn't seem to me.
Yeah, and that's spot on. I mean, you see with the abolish the police thing, like they think they want to abolish Western culture and everything that encompasses it because they think that it's a white male thing instead of like a collection of things. Because one thing I'm seeing in science, for instance, is this decolonization of science, where
Yeah, what's
and
that
what they're
about?
doing is, I mean, where do I start? So a part of it is it's all about erasing the contributions of white scientists, and the way they do it is either one, they'll focus on their personal life and poke something at their personal life that's very disagreeable. Like, say, for instance, Richard Feynman. He's a physicist, for those that don't know. He was known for being at Caltech. He was known for being a part of the Manhattan Project. And he did a lot of things in quantum electrodynamics. Like, he's one of the best to ever live. And what he used to do during his time was he used to go to bars and talk to women. He used to do things that today we would deem bad. But of course, when you're looking in hindsight, or when you're looking, in hindsight at things versus with foresight, like at the time, it wasn't a bad thing, which is like talking to graduate students and painting them. He painted, I think, a grad student naked, and it was with her consent and stuff like that. And she even came out to support him after many articles by feminists who tried to cancel him. But like, so they'll take him and they'll say he's not a reason to praise as a good scientist because of his personal life. Or what they will do is they'll revise history. And what's being done with that is like stuff with like how DNA was discovered, like with Watson and Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin, for instance. So what they're saying is that Crick stole all the stuff from Franklin, and she had everything, and she took this photo and she wasn't awarded the Nobel Prize, when the Nobel Prize isn't given to people who died already, and she died before it was given. And then two, she didn't take the photo 51 that a lot of people praise. One of her graduate students did, who's ironically a male, and he didn't get any Nobel Prize or a citation for that, other than the fact that people who cite it are is from the actual study. Like, he's cited in the study, but he's not cited as like one of the discoverers of DNA. But people would ignore that because it's all about saying the white man is bad and women and non-white people are the oppressed, and we have to erase everything that white men have done. And this is done like in mathematics, this is done in biology, physics, is done everywhere in STEM. And this decolonization move, and it ties up into what you're saying when it comes to erasing things or abolishing things, because now we're seeing this with the police. They want to abolish the police and everything like that in places like where you came from, with Chicago, which has a very high crime rate. And, the police is needed there more than anything. Yet you have these people, usually from universities, usually from places that were never in these high crime areas. Like, I have friends that have died through gun violence. I have family members who have died through gun violence. That's the reason why I speak about black on black crime a lot, because I've actually seen it and experienced that. So the people who are disregarding it, I really suspect that a lot of them aren't from these areas, and they have no connection to that. Like, they never really felt or seen what that has done behind the scenes. So yeah, it's just a horrible situation altogether. And I think that abolishing stuff isn't going to solve the issues that diversity campaigns claim to want to solve.
Why do you think, it might be an easy question, but the real question is the second question. So the first question is, why do you think people are focusing on police violence, not black on black crime? And what do you think is something that we can understand about black and black crime? Like, how do we conceive of that?
Well, I think to the first question, I think people are focusing on police violence because that's the easier thing to do, and because like there is one good argument from that side that Police violence is a little bit worse because it's government backed violence. You know what I mean? And I understand that point of view. However, police violence, no matter if it's physical brutality or police shootings, are extremely rare. Extremely rare when you look at the figures on this. And when it comes to police shootings, there's no racial element that's attributed to it by economic standards. I mean, like, I think Roland Fryer did a study. I'm not sure if it was in 2017, but he updated it in 2019. And although he did find some racial disparities when it came to police brutality and people saying that they've experienced police brutality largely from Black and Hispanic
Latino,
people. But when it came to police shootings, there was no connection when it came to race. Like, there was no difference in how that was. So, but that's often ignored because of the narrative that police are out here executing, because you'll hear that police are executing Black men by, these Black Lives Matter members, and that's just not true. And by the way, I went to some of those protests just to see how it was and just to get my own opinion of it. And a lot of the rhetoric is that police are executing people and police are just killing people every single day when, there's not even 360 police shootings of Black people in a year. So I think it's just the easier thing to do, to blame the police, and it takes away the other thing, which is self-accountability. Like, it's harder to look upon oneself or to look at what the community is doing itself, such as not solving crimes. Like, in the Black community, I think crimes go unsolved the most because of the non-snitching culture. Like, everyone knows that it's very hard to find Black people who will
testify
testify and those things because of the whole non-snitching culture. Even though the non-snitching culture are for people who are in that life, or in the streets. It's not for regular everyday citizens. It's only if you're, doing bad. But that's, again, it's easier to point to the government or to point to systems instead of pointing to people who are doing these things within these communities. What was the other part of your question?
Well, how do you think that from the outside we could conceive of what this issue is? What is the actual issue, if you understand it, or insofar as you understand it? What is the issue, and what do you think are some of the ways that it will or might be resolved?
Well, I think two things can be right at the same time. We could say that police brutality is an issue while saying that Black on Black crime is an issue. The reason why I talk about Black on Black crime a little more for two reasons, and that's one, because it happens a lot more, and two, because when you bring it up, people evade it or ignore it. And when it's evaded or ignored in the face of, like, trying to have a discussion, then you never get to what the actual issue is. So, but whereas like with police brutality, at least we're talking about ways that we can change that, except there's one way that could really lower the amount of police brutality incidents, and that's to not commit crimes. But again, that's built on the premise that you're taking self-accountability, and people don't want to take accountability for themselves. So, I just think that, we have to keep in mind that, more than one thing can be right at the same time. And also we must try to come to the most accurate truth that we can come to on these issues. Yeah.
What you were saying about decolonizing science or STEM or whatever, it seems there's a nugget of truth that goes around kind of the topic of representation. They seem to be wanting to have more representation of females and what they call people of color. Do you see the need for that in your own life, seeing yourself as a scientist? Did you need Neil deGrasse Tyson there? Was that very important for you to have that person there for you to see yourself in that role?
Not at all. Not at all. I was never taught to look to see myself in something before I could be that. I was told that I could be anything I wanted to be by my parents, regardless of what skin color represents me. And I think that's a bigger issue, and that's a great question, because how many parents are teaching children that they have to look for representation in order to feel good about becoming something? You know, like, who was Barack Obama's representation to become president? Who was Booker T. Washington's representation to open up thousands of schools? You know, there are tons of people throughout history that didn't have representation, and all you need is one example in order to know that it's possible. And I just think that the narrative that's very, very popular in STEM, that representation means everything, that's a horrible thing. I like, there was one person in STEM, I think she's a microbiologist. We were talking, and she like was really troubled by the fact that I didn't see representation as being important. And I said, well, imagine if I taught you that going into every room, those that didn't have the same shoes as you are aggressing you, and it should make you insecure, and you shouldn't feel right, you know, just because you didn't have the same shoes as someone in another room. Like, you would tell me that I'm crazy for teaching you that. So why is it not crazy to teach that we have to look for representation of race or gender, sex, whatever, in order to achieve something great? Like, merit should be enough. What should be taught is, like, as long as you reach the standards that everyone else is reaching, that's enough in order to get by. But you know, that's not being taught. Everything is about identity.
Have you felt condescended to by your professors, like, because of your identity, that you need something, or they hold you to the same standard as everybody else?
If anything, I felt that they coddled me a little bit. Like, there's some who are like, oh, you know, I know that there's so much racism around, and I need to help you more than any other person, you know, and I'm like, oh, no, I don't, you know, necessarily agree with that. And yeah, I'm fine. Trust me, I'm fine. And then they're like, oh, are you sure? And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure. So there's been a coddling that's been going on. But when it comes to aggressing me because I'm of a certain race, no, I never had that experience in academia.
You seem so chill. I want to ask you maybe a personal question, so you don't have to answer this, but what really pisses you off? What really grinds your gears? You seem so chill. I wonder, what's your trigger? I guess in the Twitter sphere, just specifically in the Twitter sphere. What?
I mean, I have a lot of those. I do have a lot of those. I just, maybe I don't show it nearly as much, but let me see.
I don't think you should, but I just
yeah.
What's the hot button issue? What's something that gets you hot under the collar?
I mean, the usual. I just, maybe people who are very hypocritical. You know, like people, for instance, that say, oh, you know, Black voices matter, because you'll hear this throughout academia. Black voices matter. Like, we need to uplift Black voices, and we need to hear stories of Black voices more and everything. And then when there's a Black voice that they don't agree with, then they play this game of either blackballing you of different opportunities. So, like, there are scientists, for instance, that have they know people at certain magazines, they know people at certain conferences, and they'll warn these people of you before you were to get these opportunities, and they'll prevent you from getting opportunities, or it'll prevent you from building relationships with certain people. I even had one time someone that was a part of I think he was a part of a physics program. I'm not 100% sure. And I haven't been putting in for graduate school applications yet, but he said to me, because I disagree with him on, I think it was a feminist issue or something. He said to me, I'm going to warn my advisors to not consider your application when it does come in for our university and things. And I'm going to tell them that they should watch out for you when it comes to being around women, because you can't be trusted around women based off disagreeing with him on Twitter. So, there are those types in academia, and I really, really can't stand it, because a part of it is because, in my experiences, most of it has come from people who weren't black or weren't considered people of color. I think my biggest opponents have been non-black people, non-Hispanic or anything. Like, mostly, I would say, white women in STEM. They're another set of people who are very, very condescending and divisive when it comes to that, and they have that mean girls culture within STEM. So they'll do this to other women too, by the way, like other women who would come in and they'll question whether or not what they're saying is true, and then they'll cancel them, and then those women will come to me and was like, oh, I've heard so much about you, and now I get it to why you were against what they're against. I've had tons of women come to me, tell me about that, and men too, but mostly women who will come to me and say, like, it's horrible. Like, I even have screenshots of them talking about you in different academic groups, and doing this or doing that, or planning to blackball you of this opportunity. And yeah, I think that's what grinds my gears the most. I don't talk about that nearly as much on Twitter, but I do talk about it a lot on Instagram, because I have a lot more of a following of people within the science community on Instagram.
It's very telling that this ideology or this way of thinking, it's all about protecting the vulnerable. And the most vulnerable, I mean, this is a cliche, but it's so true. The most vulnerable group is the individual, and that's the one who gets the brunt of the blowback for thinking differently, for asking the wrong questions, for disagreeing. You'll get hounded out if you don't follow this. And the other thing about this ideology or this way of thinking is that it really does bring out the worst or protects the worst in people. It either brings it out or allows it to happen, and it's really upsetting in a way.
Yeah, it's very upsetting. It's very upsetting. I'm going to turn on my light real quick so it's not as dark. I'm sorry.
That's right.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
So, I think individualism is definitely it's like a lost virtue in a way, you know? I wish that people value the individual more than the collective, but it seems like the collectivism is like the new punk or something. Like, it's like the trendy thing now.
It feels so claustrophobic, and maybe this is another kind of pattern that I've seen with you, and like what makes you kind of invulnerable to getting swept up into this is that you did a lot of reading. That's something you said. A lot of other people who are against this stuff have actually done a lot of reading. It doesn't seem like you did a lot of fiction reading. I don't know, but you did a lot of reading. You've explored a lot of different people's minds. And I think that is it might be possibly one thing that's contributing to this, is kind of like the lost kind of reading culture in a way.
Yeah, definitely. What we see, for instance, with White Fragility, which is a book I'm almost done with.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah. I'm actually, trying my best to get through that book. And it's entertaining and interesting for reasons the author didn't intend. But I try to read this because, like, I think it's important to understand where the arguments are, because one of the most annoying things I see is when people talk past one another. So, like, a good example of that is like the opponents of Black Lives Matter would say something like all lives matter, but that's like talking past them, because they're not saying only Black Lives Matter, they're saying Black Lives Matter too. And even though they're wrong about their premise and their conclusions, you're still talking past them whenever you say all lives matter. So in the same way, people do the same when it comes to white fragility or these critical race theory concepts. And you have to read their material in order to understand their arguments and then to properly attack their arguments where they are. Mm-hmm. And I see that most people aren't really doing that on both sides, but especially not from the the intersectionality side. They're not reading any material whatsoever from the other side. Like all these reading book lists of things to understand Black experiences. Like there's no Thomas Sowell, there's no Walter Williams, there's no Booker T. Washington or any other Black intellectual that told you to worry about yourself, improve yourself, and then you could worry about everything else and through political means.
What's a tidbit from D'Angelo that really particularly popped out for you?
I think most of all, it was just the usual. I would say it's basically what is getting her canceled now is the idea that there's a lot of white people who are so fragile or whatever that they're promoting themselves up to be like, the savior in a way, and they're not allowing other Black people to have a voice. And it's funny because in a way, like, she's doing that. So like it's okay for her to do that, but it's not okay for others to do that. Like, and then she's profiting. And someone brought up a really good point. Like, I wonder where all these profits are going, considering the fact that her book is like #1 seller like these last few months or something. So yeah, I think that just the whole paradox behind like her ideas and how they're not really sound, and none of the arguments and I wouldn't say none of the arguments, but most of the arguments in her books aren't really sound at all, logically.
Is there a group that you know of within your domain of STEM or physics that other people in your position, not your identity, but your position, they want to do science, they're confronted with all this identity politic, etc. stuff. Are there groups that are formed, or like support groups or just free thinking groups that you recommend them to look for or reach out for?
Not that I know of. Okay. I mean, actually, yeah, there's the Heterodox Academy, which is basically it's a group of intellectuals that are both undergrad students now and grad students, and people postdoc and all that other stuff that vary among the political spectrum. It was started by Jonathan Haidt and someone else, I think. So I would say look to that, because a lot of those people are open to discussing things and things of that nature. When it comes to like my university or just online itself, I haven't found any groups outside of the Heterodox Academy that's been really good. With that, I have thought about starting something like that, because there are, like I said, a lot of women that will come to me and be like, hey, like, we might disagree on a couple of things, but one thing I agree on is like we need to have a discussion about these things. And there are people within STEM community that don't want to have a discussion. They deem me as racist because I'm white, or they deem me as having internalized racism because I'm Black. And I want to have these discussions more, but I have nowhere to go with it. And I'm afraid I will lose my opportunity because my advisor is heavily influenced by this, or whatever, the person over me is heavily influenced by this, so I can't speak out about it. But I do want a group to where we could talk about this openly, so they have expressed support for if I did start it, that they would become a part of it. So maybe in the future I would start something like that.
Do you have a fancy name for it yet?
Not yet. I'm not that creative. Do you have any suggestions?
I would have to think about that. We could do like a Twitter war and come up with some names or something like that.
Yeah. Something better than that intellectual dark web for sure, though. Something much better than that, because that was like a lazy effort. I felt like so.
I'm on board with you there. That was as soon as it was named, it was over. Like
and then the photo shoot really put in a coffin. I mean, that was just my goodness. Like they could have did a lot better than that.
Well, awesome. Any advice? I think that the common value that we both share is like you take responsibility for yourself, you build up your own skills, and then you worry about things all the social stuff secondarily. But do you have any other tips or tricks that have guided you in your experience in the academy and towards mastery of the physical universe?
I would just say to speak up more. I think more people do need to speak up, regardless of your race. I understand how it can be hard. I understand that, at jobs and everything, like they might consider your social media to be problematic and all this other stuff. So I understand how some people can't, but I really think that it's important to at least try to speak up about some of this and have conversations without being divisive. I think people from all sides need to learn about what they disagree about more than they actually do. It's more than a tweet. Critical race theory is a whole concept that has origins in Marxism and this whole idea of the oppressor and the oppressed narrative. Same with Black Lives Matter and stuff. Like, I just think people need to be less naive and read more into the things that they oppose. And lastly, I would say that, when it comes to policy, especially when it comes to things relating to science, I think things need to be evidence-based, but experts should always be on tap, not on top. What I mean by that is just because someone is an expert, it doesn't mean that you should blindly follow them and believe everything that they believe on this issue. Their expertise is of a specific field, of a very specific thing in their field. Like for instance, with me, I want to become a theoretical physicist, and there's going to be a specific part of theoretical physics that I'm a part of. So I'll have expertise in that part and might not have expertise on all of physics in general. In the same way, we need to look at that when it comes to, no matter if it's with Dr. Fossey or whatnot, or when it comes to Michael Mann, the climate scientist, we need to understand that they have expertise in a certain part, but that doesn't mean to just blindly believe everyone. And, lastly, critical thinking is the most important thing here. Like, that's one thing I think everyone can learn. You don't have to learn science to know how to think critically better, but science can empower you to think more critically and to arrive at better conclusions.
What made you choose science then? What set you down that path?
I've always been into science. My mom was really into biology. She used to take me to the science observatory probably like once a month when I was little. So like it started early. I didn't look at it as a career until about, I would say about 4 years ago or so, because I'm 29, but it was about 4 years ago, and I was just working regular odd jobs, and I woke up to a documentary, and it was about a physicist that was inspired to get into physics because his father had died of a heart attack, and he wanted to go back in time to prevent his father from getting that heart attack by warning him. And he found out that Einstein's relativity allows for time travel, which it does, by the way. So he dedicated his life to learning physics so he could possibly build the foundations to, making a time travel machine one day or something. So I was really inspired by that story because I love time travel. I love sci-fi. So I didn't know that relativity allowed for such a wide range of things to be possible. So I delved deep into it from then on. And I haven't looked back ever since.
What do you think's the more likely apocalyptic scenario? A robot uprising or a tear in the space-time continuum from some uppity physicist trying to design a time travel machine?
That's a good question. Physicists are a weird bunch. I'm gonna go with the robot uprising. Right. Definitely with AI, it's a messy scenario. I definitely want to do some research in AI. I think a lot more theory is needed in that. But yeah, an AI uprising is definitely closer to happening and more plausible than pesky physicists messing up everything that we know.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eric. This is great to speak with you, bring you out of the Twitter sphere and into the podcast realm.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, because your podcast realm is really interesting. Like, just looking at it from afar and looking at all the stories and hearing people, it's always interesting. So, yeah, I hope to be back one day. It would be good talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, keep you in mind. I'll set everybody up with your official Twitter handle is Eric's Electrons. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. That's my
and your
handle
Instagram
everywhere.
So we can see your abs. Is that Eric's Electrons too?
No abs.
No?
Nah, but no, actually, I think there's one maybe, but yeah, I think Eric's Electrons is my thing across multiple platforms, and I even have a YouTube channel, but I don't really post much there. I every now and then I'll do a video. It's because I suck at video editing. Like, I'm really bad at it. It's too time consuming for me. I might have someone else do it in the future, but I definitely want to get more into YouTube stuff in the future.
Yeah, you should. People need cool scientists telling them how to think critically, whatever that means.
Yeah, I agree. Instead of telling them what to think, like a lot of these, other scientists like to do.
Ideologues.
Yeah, especially the Michael Manns. Oh, did I tell you I'm blocked by Michael Mann?
Who's Michael Mann? That's not the film director.
He's a climate scientist. Maybe he's made a film too. I don't think so though.
Michael Moore?
No, not Michael Moore. Yeah,
Michael Mann. Okay,
Michael Mann. Yeah, he's a climate scientist. He's basically known for like the hockey stick graph and all the other stuff.
Okay.
His work is really legit. He's a good climate scientist, but he's very influenced by identity politics. And I asked him one time, like, what does it matter that a panel have like black people or women on it? Because he was complaining about that, and he just blocked me out of nowhere. So yeah, I think science needs more of a tolerant voices and within the science sphere.
Thin-skinned scientists. Who would have thought?
Oh yeah, and then I would argue that most of them are that way outside of their discipline. Like, they're incredibly thin-skinned about every little issue, and it's I'm trying to get it to where I could get them together on a podcast and then let them know my views and see from a different perspective of why it isn't, white supremacy to think this, or how that I arrived there, because a lot of them, they don't have these type of conversations ever. They just see what they see on Twitter and then retweet. So
I think a lot of this stuff, this identity politics stuff, really loses its power when you have to see somebody as a human being and through time, right? Instead of through these little tiny windows that we've reduced each other into. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
All right, Eric. Well, you have a good afternoon. I'll let you know when this is out, man.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. You have a good afternoon too.
All right, dude. Ciao.
All right. Bye.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.